Hello, students. This is Dr. Shyaonti Talwar, and in this session, we are going to look at the scepter and the torch. This is an essay by Helen Gardner. So, in the beginning, Dr. Gardner lays the premise of the essay. So, I'm just going to give you a few uh, foundational ideas based on which she talks about the functions or the qualities of an ideal critic or the duties that a critic should perform. So she starts by saying that by calling these lectures the profession of a critic, I suggest one thing, but I intend another. So, actually, it might seem that she is trying to lay out or present a manual of what a critic should or should not do, but it turns out that she is trying to present a completely different idea, a completely unconventional idea of what or who, in fact, a critic is. So she says these days the tone of literary criticism is extremely professional and there's very little feeling in critical writing. So she's obviously not too happy with this trend in criticism where it is very dry, it is very impersonal, and it sounds very didactic and professional, and there is no place for any subjective response in criticism. And she goes on to say that a certain severity and strenuousness reigns. So just look at the words she's using. Severity, that is harshness or a very disciplinarian attitude, and strenuousness is uh, a lot of hard work, a lot of tension, a lot of rigor. And she says the notion that anybody with natural taste, some experience of life, a decent grounding in the classics, and the habit of wide reading can talk profitably on English literature is highly unfashionable. Now, so in other words, we get to see what are the ideas that Gardiner, in fact, um, holds high, or what in her eyes are the best practices of criticism. So she thinks a critic should be someone who has a natural taste, who has a reasonably good foundation of reading the classics, and a critic is also a critic can be someone who has some experience of a life, that is a lived experience of lived reality, and who engages in wide reading. But unfortunately, she is saying that these qualities are not adequate, they are not enough to qualify as a critic. And what sees instead in criticism is that criticism is full of jargons, it is full of literary terms and terminologies, and it is in fact unintelligible. Unintelligible meaning uh, you cannot understand it. So it has very difficult vocabulary, which in fact, instead of making the understanding of a text more lucid and easy, it adds to the complications. It creates roadblocks in understanding a text, right? And in her opinion, she says so many contributions to critical journals consist not of studies of writers or their works, but of considerations of Mr. X's modifications, of Mr. Y's criticism, of Mr. Z's article on a particular topic. So she is trying to say that instead of a critic directly responding to a work of art, what they try to do is they are looking at someone else's response. So, say Mr. Miss A has written something. Now, Miss B, instead of looking at Miss A's work and responding to it, she is going to what Miss C has said about Miss A's work, and she's commenting on Miss C. So that is the complexity and the complication, the unnecessary complication which criticism poses today. And what is happening is, as a result of that, Gardner says that when the ordinary cultured reader, okay, so someone who reads literature, she calls them cultured. So she says someone who is picking up a critical journal like this feels. So, what does that person feel? The experience of the reader who picks up the critical journal, as if the reader is entering a cinema in the middle of a gangster film, baffled about the antecedents of the battle which is raging and uncertain as to who is fighting on whose side. So she says this is like the spectator, who comes in the middle, who enters the theater, the dark theater, in the middle of a film, and a typical potboiler film where there's a fighting scene happening, there's an action scene happening. uh, Indian students are very familiar with these kind of movies, right? That where everyone is fighting with everyone. So the reader feels like that on picking up a critical journal, because the reader has no clue as to who is on whose side, who is fighting against who. So it's like entering in, making an entry in the action scene of a gangster film without having an idea of the context or the story, right? Now, Gardner admits that some developments, criticism has changed over the years, and she says yes, it had to change, because now there are new disciplines and there are new bodies of knowledge like historical science, psychological science, anthropology, and all of these have had an impact on the style and the discipline of literary criticism. And she says yes, a work of art is, and now there's a whole different way of looking at a work of art, which we do not see as the author's expression but a product of a culture, right? And she also attributes the changing attitude in criticism to technology. So she says that nowadays libraries are catalogued, and there are indexes of indexes and bibliographies of bibliographies, and everything is so well recorded. So you have to take into account every single scholar, whoever may have said something about a piece of work. So she calls this the widening of the intellectual horizon. And she says to combine with it the technology of the photostat. Photostat is Xerox, right? Where you can make copies of things. Then there's something called microfilm. So in today's parlance, it would be like you can capture digital images of books and stuff. So obviously, the critic experiences a compulsion of uh, having to know every single piece of opinion on a particular literary text. If you are a critic and you don't know what Mr. Z from Argentina or what Miss X from, say, Peru have said about a literary piece, then obviously it is just a weakness of the flesh. It means you have been lazy, you have not been resourceful, you have not actually tried to source all the information available. Because now, with technological advancement and digital advancement, you can't even come up with an excuse. So, most of criticism today is a reflection on what other critics have said about a particular piece of work. And that is something Gardner doesn't look at very favorably. Okay. So, and she is also skeptical. That is, she is in great doubt about the training and standards that should be taken for granted by someone who calls himself a literary critic, because she says critics themselves have not arrived at a consensus. So, how do we know, or how do we decide that these are the qualities that a good critic should have? Because critics themselves have not arrived at a decision, or they have not arrived at an agreement that yes, A, B, C, D, these are the four qualities that a good critic should have. So she is, in fact, against the idea of criticism as a discipline with uniform standards or a set of beliefs and practices. So she said criticism can't be treated as a monolithic discipline with no variation, and it cannot be treated, it cannot have a uniform set of rules, beliefs, or practices.